Welcome to the Modern Money podcast, where we explore innovators driving the evolution of finance. Today, I'm really excited to sit down with Peter Watts, who's the founder of Reservoir. We have known Peter for a while, given our work on NFT checkout and more recently on some of the other products they have. Reservoir has recently integrated MoonPay as well on their new Relay product. So this is opening up new possibilities for developers and users alike. So when we were thinking about who do we have on for the show, and Peter, you're one of the early ones, I would say, number 2 or number 3. And I was personally just excited to welcome you to the show because I think there's some really interesting stories to not only to your background, but also to Reservoir. And I would love to dive in a little more on that, especially maybe just to kick it off. Help us understand how did Reservoir come? What was the genesis of it? What were you doing before? And how did it materialize? And what was your decision matrix like? It's never easy starting a company.
Yep, great to be here. We can go right back to the beginning. Before Reservoir, I would say my origin is very much in music. So I built a lot of music-related products, was in bands, all my friends in bands, and that's always been like a piece in the background over my arc and some of the early companies that I started. But then I ended up at a live streaming company. And this company was called YouNow, was one of the early virtual currency live streaming products in the US. They were thinking a lot, it was also around the time 2017, and you started to see kind of ethereum breakout, and then a lot of thinking about social tokens and ways this app was already paying creators in dollars, but these creators, they weren't necessarily loyal to the platform. If someone paid more, they might leave the platform. So there's a lot of thinking about how can applications turn users into owners? And then similarly of the streamers, how can those kind of streamers turn fans into stronger community members? So a lot of thinking around tokens and tokenization and social tokens, these sorts of things, and the fact that anyone can create these new assets. And then obviously NFTs with the evolution, we went from fungible tokens. NFTs really started to emerge, particularly with CryptoPunks and like the derivatives that happened where you saw these strong communities form. And NFTs were also just a more approachable asset for people to issue rather than a creator, for example, having a coin and all the implications of that. They could instead create these like unique assets that were just maybe collectible or unlocked some sort of content. So you basically saw this explosion of new assets and the fact that anyone could create them, this really interesting new primitive. But the ability to trade these things was constrained. And so this was the origin of Reservoir, where it was like, if people are going to hold Taylor Swift NFTs instead of Apple stock, how are they going to be able to know what those are worth? How are they going to be able to sell them? And like, how can we create new liquidity mechanisms around these new assets? So this was the origin where, ironically, you had this new decentralized assets, but then they were all just traded on a centralized marketplace, OpenSea, that looked a lot like eBay. So it felt like we hadn't actually evolved. We weren't really taking advantage of the composability of these things, where maybe the goal would be that these assets can be issued, but then they're appearing directly in a social feed. I can buy them. I don't have to go to the marketplace. Anyone can create their own marketplace, and the liquidity can be shared across many marketplaces. So this is the idea behind Reservoir, was to create this like global pool of liquidity where you could access any NFT that was available and easily buy or sell it. And there's been many kind of evolutions from there of some of the newer products that we've built, but that was the origin.
What was the aha moment there where you felt you had enough of the idea crystallized and you felt this is a good place for me to spend time on? And how did you take that, let's call it a semi-crystallized idea, and then hone it towards what eventually became Reservoir and the audiobook aggregation product, which really took off? Help us understand that transition there.
Yeah, I think maybe it's a combination of two things. One was the feeling that there's a really interesting primitive here with on-chain assets, like specifically NFTs, but increasingly you're seeing this emerge with things like meme coins. But basically just the ease that anyone can create these assets and they like can immediately exist on Rails, where they're easy to view what exists, easy to transfer to people. They can have reliable supply, and so they can have value. And as they have value, then that just, all of these things come from that. So definitely the first aha moment is, okay, this is a really powerful primitive. Sometimes with powerful primitives, they get abused, but there's clearly kind of something extremely powerful here. And then I think the second piece was just like seeing the gap between blockchains enable the primitive. They enable tokens to be created, but then there's just so many missing pieces around how you discover these assets, how you trade them, how you like move between them. And increasingly there are many blockchains as how you go between the blockchains. All of these pieces were missing, and that was just a very exciting opportunity and was filling that gap. And so it was like this exciting thing where there's so much to build here, but the infrastructure is not there, and it was an exciting kind of problem to solve. And one of the nice things about building infrastructure is the leverage, where like when people come and then build on top of your infrastructure, it's just really cool to see all the different things that can get built with that. That was the moment of there's something big here, but there's also a need and a very kind of exciting product to build when you're enabling other developers and creators to do interesting things.
Yeah. And on that point, did you ever, obviously there's a need in the market. You looked around and said, did you have a question of like, why hasn't this been built? And was there an angle where you're like, I probably have the best angle here, or have the best team? Or how are you thinking about that question from a, let's call it a market perspective? And you looked around, clearly a need, no one is building it, there must be a reason why.
Maybe other entrepreneurs have a more thoughtful process. I think if I look back, like it maybe wasn't like, what are all the possible ideas that can be built? What is the market research of this? It's just you get pulled down a rabbit hole, you start hacking on something, thinking about something. Definitely there was like a bit of a process of all these really interesting ideas, how you could create better liquidity, how you could make these assets more composable. And I surfaced those eyes. One of the early people that I talked to was Jesse Walden from Variant. And I posed the question of, surely somebody's doing this. And the answer was like, no, but if you want to do it, we'd fund you. And so that was one of the nice kind of early signals of, okay, let's jump and go for this. But in some ways, it's very much been an iterative process and figure it out as we go. And the vision becomes almost clearer as you go, rather than it was known from the outset. It's start with a fascinating problem to solve that you enjoy solving, and then like figure out the business opportunity as you go.
How did you go about hiring?
A couple of things. An interesting founding story where it was started between myself, and I was living in Australia, and George, my co-founder, who was living in Romania, and we'd never met, but we worked together. I hired him at a previous company, and we just work incredibly well together. And in some ways, being on opposite sides of the world was actually a superpower, where he's an amazing engineer that I can give just like very rough ideas of what I have in mind, and he'll just read my mind and go and build it. And so you have this 24/7 getting things done. So there's a really nice partnership, and we'd work together even though we hadn't met in person. And then I'd previously lived in New York for 10 years. So I'd only just come back to Australia where I grew up, but most of my network was in New York. So I went to a lot of the people that I'd worked with before and knew and hired those people. And then another interesting piece is that we've done 2 acquisitions really early on, really small teams that have worked out incredibly well. So one of the first teams that started building on top of Reservoir, really talking deeply with them and what it could enable. And they were trying to build an application on top and thinking about like liquidity primitives for NFTs, like trait bids. These things were brand new and untested in the early days. And it was, you guys should join us. So that was kind of Jason and Michael on the team. And then later there was another company called Module, and they were doing some similar things to Reservoir. And they had this like amazing kind of 19-year-old engineer leading it, Dior. And it was, we're doing the same thing, we should join forces. And so Dior joined us and now is like leading a lot of the relay swap routing work. And so we've been very lucky to be able to find other teams along the way and join forces with them and actually have that work. I think often the body can reject the organ, but for us, it's worked out pretty nicely. And yeah, we grew to 20 pretty quickly and then just stayed there. It was like a nice size for us. We had people that kind of had worked together for many years. And then we've just executed with that in that and shifted the products that we build along the way. But now we're just getting to the point where it's like time to probably grow to the next phase.
Yeah, and this really excites me as a deal guy. I've always felt I've underutilized the acquisition playbook, even in a super early phase when you're, instead of hiring individually, you can potentially get a team that has been working together, hopefully 1 or 2 or 3 engineers, and there's some synergies there. Obviously, the trade-off being you have to convince them to take what you're putting up on the table. How was that process? How did you do that? Because I think it's all great to have the idea, and not a lot of people even have the idea, but then to execute on it and convince people to join your team when arguably they could potentially be doing something similar. How was that? How did you navigate that?
Yeah, it is a challenge because anyone who's started their own thing, these are extremely dynamic people that have that capability. So they're the best people to have on your team. And having other entrepreneurs within the org, but they're also the people that have the most leverage or the most flexibility in what they do. For us, in both cases, these teams hadn't yet raised VC funding. So I think that definitely helped. The equation definitely changes once there's funding and the math gets a bit harder. But in both of these cases, they were extremely early. And so they were faced with the decision of, okay, do we go down this path, deal with raising money ourselves and all of those pieces, or do I join forces with something that's done a lot of that and then I can focus more on building product, which is maybe the more interesting piece. So we got lucky there where they were super early, and that definitely helped. And then, but yeah, in both cases, it was people that were already extremely aligned, and it helps to work together. So in the case of Jason and Michael, we were just working so much. They were building on top of us that it was like we knew them already. I think it's really hard to do an acquisition when especially if maybe they're a competitor, right? So you're very wary of getting too close in the event that it doesn't work out. So the second one with Module, that was more of we just rolled the dice a little bit we got along and we both had the same vision. But yeah, if possible, if you can find a way to actually work deeply together, that's a nice kind of way to trial it.
Yeah, it's harder than it looks. For those that are not familiar with Reservoir, or at least the full kind of arc of Reservoir, because it has been a bit of a journey, maybe take us through kind of the graduation from NFT tooling, infrastructure, why that made sense, why you're building, and perhaps how you're thinking about 2025 for Reservoir.
Yeah. So the origin was very much NFT focused and how do we improve liquidity for NFTs? And there was two parts to that. One was aggregating existing liquidity and making it more accessible. And then the second piece was having an order book that someone could come along and create their own marketplace. And that product did well, continues to do well. It's powering all of Magic Eden's EVM marketplaces. It's powering kind of a bunch of other secondary trading in a lot of places like Highlight and a lot of the other vertical specific NFT marketplaces, including some of these app chains like Proof of Play's Pirate Nation. And then it's used by all sorts of applications like wallets, all the big wallets, MetaMask, Rainbow, Coinbase Wallet, are using some of the data that we have or allowing people to instant sell NFTs in the wallet. And then even social feeds like Warpcast, if you want to mint in the feed, they're often using us to know how to mint any NFT. So that was the initial focus. And one of the biggest shifts was the explosion of chains. And this actually worked out really well for us because on new chains, there's less infrastructure. On Ethereum, you can make the argument of OpenSea does the job. Let's just use OpenSea. But once you get to a world of many chains, the need for kind of flexible infrastructure or the need to run your own marketplace maybe becomes greater because the infrastructure doesn't exist. So we very much doubled down on this trend and really optimized everything for our ability to go to every chain or as many chains as possible as easily as possible. How can we structure ourselves so that the overhead to go to a new chain is small? And so we don't have to think too much about it. We can go everywhere because you never know where interesting things are going to. But as we started going to new chains, it creates this different problem around, okay, these assets are maybe going to exist in all of these different places. Are people really going to have money fragmented across all of these chains? So I think the fragmentation of chains, effectively the fragmentation of long tail assets and state, like maybe like your game and like your pet and what its level is, that is a good to fragment, right? You get all these benefits from scaling, from differentiation of doing things differently, not having to worry about noisy neighbors. So fragmentation is good. It allows innovation, allows scale, but then you really don't want fragmentation of money. And so we started thinking a lot around how people are going to hold money on chain and be able to spend it everywhere and not need to necessarily bridge. They could have money in one place. This was like the origin of thinking about where things are going. And in order to, like, let's say you want to hold money on one chain and just in time buy a $1 NFT on some other chain, you need an extremely kind of fast, cheap bridge effectively to do that just in time and have a really good UX that feels just like you're checking out and as if it basically makes all chains feel as if they're one. And that became like the key focus for us. So in the same way that we made all NFT marketplaces feel like one and any NFT, you could access it. It doesn't matter where the item might be listed, if it's in an order book, if it's in a NFTX AMM pool, it didn't matter, just made them all feel like one. The kind of expansion of the vision became, we need to make all chains feel like one. And that requires a really hyper efficient bridge. And nothing on the market kind of was designed that way. I think we had a unique insight where we were coming from NFTs and consumer and lower valued items, and also thinking about app chains, whereas a lot of bridges came from DeFi. You're moving really large amounts of money. Doesn't matter if it uses lots of gas. Doesn't matter if it takes 10 minutes. All of these kind of factors didn't matter so much, whereas we came from the opposite angle, and so we had to design something under extreme constraints. And so we went through a few iterations in terms of protocols we designed, and then landed on the product, which is called Relay, and it just allows for extremely fast kind of movement of value between any chain. And then we effectively combine that with the actual movement of value between chains is mostly major assets like the gas token ETH or something like USDC, but then you can combine that with a swap on either the origin chain or the destination chain or both to effectively move any token to any token. And then you can also combine it with a call any contract on the destination. And that allows things like, oh, I want to buy an NFT. So you're bridging money, maybe you're swapping, but then you are making a call. And you can basically, almost all actions you do on a blockchain can be decomposed into the input. What am I spending? The output, like what is needed for the action I want to do, and then the calls that I want executed. And so when you just do a simple swap, that's an input and an output with kind of no calls. If you want a cross-chain bridge, that's it. The input is on one chain and the output's on a different chain. If you want to buy an NFT and it's listed in ETH, but you have USDC on a different chain, you're doing all three of those. You're doing a swap, you're going cross-chain, and you're executing a call. And so with Relay, we just wanted to design something extremely simple where, again, like all the chains feel like one. You're just saying, this is how I want to pay. This is what I want to do. This is the output that I want. And we're going to take care of the routing for that. We're going to find ways to get liquidity that is extremely fast. And we can get into that, like the different types of bridging, where your more traditional bridges, you really wait a long time for the user's payment on the origin to finalize. And then you send a message to the destination and give them the money. Whereas this new class of bridges, or kind of way to make cross-chain value transfer, is like intent-based bridges. And so you have things like a cross and Relay is in the same category. And the way that those work is you effectively have market makers that already have money on the destination, and they're willing to take more finalization risk where they might not wait as long on the origin. They might just wait one block or just see that the money landed. And then they can execute your transaction or transfer assets on the destination extremely quickly, because the way that I describe it is like in a bridge, it's a global system. So you need to be careful. Whereas in intent-based bridges, you have a marketplace of these market makers and they're competing. Whoever goes fastest is going to get the order flow. And so that really pushes the times down. And so you can get this like instant feeling UX across chains.
As you were designing different protocols, and iterating on this concept, what was it that was technically hard that you did not anticipate as you got into the idea of building Relay?
Yeah, so one of the things we developed along the way was a different protocol. There's still some doc online. We really developed it out, and basically at the point of releasing it, look, no one's going to use this. And we had two insights about it. It was a really cool product, and it actually, one of the ideas behind MemSwap was you would have this like order flow auction. So let's say the user wanted to swap token A from token B, like similar intent-based design where you can have solvers or market makers, whatever you want to call them. They're like figuring out the best way to solve this user's trade, and they're competing, and then you maybe run some auction and choose the best one. And we had some really cool ideas of how you could figure out the best one. But one of the realizations was the gas to run that auction, like the extra computation to run that auction, almost canceled out the benefits of, so you're really like squeezing out the last like 10-cent price improvement. And we looked in the mirror one day, I'm like, we're not interested in that. Like you can already get pretty good prices if you're trading some major asset on a major chain. That's not interesting to us to squeeze out the last 10 cents when there are all these routes in terms of chains where there's just like no way to move between them. Like, so certain assets that you just like, there is no route. So they're completely underserved. And one of the areas that was underserved was like, I've got a small amount, right? Like I want to buy a $1 NFT and I want to bridge. It's not going to fly if the bridge has a $5 fee and it takes 10 minutes. So we identified that by doing one protocol, we identified what we weren't excited about and was already heavily trodden territory, and a lot of great teams like CalSwap and really innovating there on how to squeeze the best prices out of major routes. And basically this blue ocean of there's all these routes that are just completely uncatered for. Every new chain that comes out, the kind of assets that are on those chains, doing it fast, doing it cheap. That was really underserved, and it really fit us in terms of this is what consumers are going to do. If we're going to have on-chain commerce, you're going to be spending a smaller amount at a time. You're not going to. So ironically, Relay's a bridge, but it's almost built for a world where you don't do like the typical bridging of, okay, I'm going to move all my money to the chain and then I'm going to make a ton of transactions. It's designed to be so cheap that you can just keep your money in one place and do things just in time. Now, people still use it in the traditional way, but it was designed under the constraints of like, how can we get to a world where you actually don't need to bridge? You can just have your money in one place.
And as you think about what's next in 2025 for you guys, maybe on the product and the distribution side, because Relay is arguably has a different go-to-market than what you built previously. So yeah, help me think through what 2025 holds for you guys.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to there, like with the different go-to-market, is historically we were a developer-only platform, whereas one of the things with Relay is we have a consumer-facing application for it. And I think there has been a bit of a shift in how we think, where the original Reservoir was like this horizontal developer platform, kind of positioned more like Stripe or Twilio, where it's like there is no application on top. It's just developer tools and other people come and build the applications on top. Whereas what we found is, for example, if we go to a new chain and we build all the pieces to bridge, but no application follows us to that chain, then the functionality is not usable. And so we realized we need some core pieces where there is like a Relay app that if you want to use, you can use it. And then wallets and other applications might be slower to follow us there and integrate that functionality into the applications. But this is a big piece of when you're on the frontier, you almost need a more vertical stack so that it's useful kind of on day one when you go to a new chain. And so I think we'll continue that. But I would say that today, like a lot of the volume of Relay is just people going to the Relay app, and they are still just doing like the old style bridging, which is ironic because we designed Relay to replace that.
Yeah.
But now we're just like a lot of people are doing like this new paradigm that we had around chain abstraction and kind of you need a faster, better, cheaper bridge. So that's what we went and built. But then people are still using it in the old way just as a better bridge. And so I think 2025 will see a lot of that transition. And there's really interesting things happening where there's like this new field around resource locks. And the idea there is if you want to go really fast between chains, like we're pretty fast, but we still have to wait a few seconds and we have to wait for the payment on the origin chain to finalize. Whereas if the user locks their money on the origin chain in some way where they can't like double spend it or change their mind, like if they say, I'm going to give you money, but as soon as you get a signature that they're going to give you money, you don't have to wait for the origin chain to finalize. Then you can get truly instant cross-chain. And so this is like an increasing field that a lot of teams are building around, and we are thinking about how we can provide the liquidity for it. But it requires users to shift their money into these like resource locked accounts. So it's similar to smart contract wallets where the adoption of it is slow. Everyone agrees that smart contract wallets have a ton of advantages and is probably the future, but it's just a slow path to get there. I think it's like a similar thing where you'll see applications start to adopt users having resource locked funds that they can instantly spend anywhere. So anyway, we're building out tooling around that. So the way that we approach it is, okay, people still, they use EOAs and they like to just explicitly bridge. So let's just build really good experiences for that whilst iterating and shifting towards the future rather than only build for the future and wait for it to come. We're going to drag people into the future while still serving their more immediate needs. So I think for us, there's like working on these new UX paradigms and different ways that people will, what I mentioned, the original vision for Relay was that people are going to hold money in one place, spend it everywhere. Like we're not there yet, but I think we're going to work towards that. There's a lot of expansion into new VMs. It's another thing from day one. We wanted to design something that wasn't just only limited to the Ethereum ecosystem. There are
Because your origins are intrinsic are tied to the EVM ecosystem in a way, or you're closer to the EVM ecosystem than some of the others.
Yeah, the Reservoir NFT product was EVM only. And whereas with Relay, we had a chance to, again, like design from scratch and actually think about how do we make this easier to bring to other VMs? Because there's two categories of alt VMs. In the Ethereum ecosystem, they're L2s to Ethereum, but they use a different VM for efficiency. And then you just have alternative L1s. And we're not maxis, even though Ethereum's the first love. There's cool stuff happening on Solana and people want to use it. And then when a new chain, like a good example is Ape Chain, when they launched, they wanted to attract Solana users. And no other bridge, there are some bridges that go Solana to EVM, but they'll just go to major chains. No one else is going Solana to Ape Chain or the next L2 that just launched. And so this is what, again, like we want to solve where no one's solving, that kind of frontier, and be able to have liquidity everywhere. So just a lot more of that, like scaling it, and really, because you can have liquidity on all these chains, but maybe the liquidity is not deep. So the next thing that we're going to announce soon is like, how can we have deeper liquidity by allowing more people to be liquidity providers? And even though Relay is based on this idea of solvers, which are effectively active liquidity providers, we also want to have kind of ways for people to be passive liquidity providers, deposit money in a pool or a vault, and that can contribute, towards making the system more liquid, because not everyone has the infrastructure and expertise to run a solver, and solvers don't have all the money. So you've got this, you really want to find a way to have more people contributing liquidity. So I think that's like the other really big piece for 2025. And then last thing I'll say is we have a newer product that we're experimenting with, where as we go to these chains and we bring instant bridging to them and allow people to come to these chains, there's other missing infrastructure. The biggest one being there's no DEX on the chain, and someone like Uniswap is maybe focused on the larger chains, whereas the kind of smaller emerging chains on day one, then they're not there. And Relay wants to be able to allow people to move between any two tokens on any two chains. And so we've started actually deploying Uniswap on the chains that we go to so that token markets can form. And I think that is one of the ways to think about what we're doing, where it's like all of the infrastructure needed to allow there to be tokens and for those tokens to trade seamlessly. And we're so on the frontier that we're actually having to go set up the DEX because nothing exists. It's not just routing between what exists. It's like, how can we actually make it easier for people to create tokens, make it easier for them to trade those tokens. And so that is like another new thing that we're increasingly getting involved in.
That is so cool, because I think what you're saying there is, yes, let's go build the DEX infrastructure, but we are better positioned because you can potentially abstract away the DEX infrastructure in a way. Back to your point about making it easy and making it more simpler to adopt. Am I capturing that correctly? Is that kind of part of the thesis?
Yeah, it's like a two-sided thing. We are well suited to set up the DEX infrastructure because we're already on the chain, we're already running infrastructure and doing a lot of the overlapping pieces with what the kind of core DEX needs in terms of indexing tokens and understanding liquidity. And then if we run the DEX, it can plug into everything else. So if someone who creates a token on a new chain, as soon as they create that token, someone with Sol on Solana, even though this is some OP stack L2, can buy that token because it just plugs straight into Relay, so that you'll get a better DEX experience because it's not isolated, it's plugged into the entire Relay network. And so that is the thesis. Sometimes we worry that we're doing too much, but there is some kind of method to the madness of these things make each other stronger. And so we're trying it out. We actually today, Kraken's Ink chain launched, and so we're deploying Uniswap there, and we have a few other chains that we're doing.
That's so cool. Interesting, right? Because I have to ask you this, because obviously there's the whole app chain thesis, and then there's the whole kind of school of thinking around Solana. I'll just leave it there. But how do you think about Reservoirs or Relay's role in these ecosystems? And is it really just about L2s to SVMs, or is there a role for the Bitcoin ecosystem or maybe some others like Cosmos? Curious to get your thoughts on how that kind of you think is going to play out.
I think the bet that we're making is all of them, and that there won't be a winner and there's like a best model. There's just trade-offs. And then even if you think about some of the Bitcoin L2s, they'll probably just look very similar to the Ethereum L2s. They'll probably use the EVM even, but just use Bitcoin as the core asset. And it's just like different communities with different origins doing it slightly differently. And there's probably parallels to Web2 infra where there are just different cloud providers and similar-ish databases, and you've just got personal preferences. And that's why kind of our view of the world is very much, let's support them all. Let's make it easy to move between all of them rather than making specific bets. Like, for example, you see these roll-up clusters emerge where you've got the Optimism roll-ups, you've got the Arbitrum roll-ups, Polygon, ZK Sync, and they've got these like really optimized intra-cluster, which is nice. But what are the odds that you have a user that kind of only wants to stay within those clusters?
Yeah.
We think it's small. And so if you're a developer and you want to allow someone to move seamlessly, you almost can't integrate the clusters, or it's not wise to integrate with the clusters directly, because as soon as the user wants to go outside of it, you're out of luck. And so you're much better off interacting with something that's very high level. And effectively, under the hood, our solvers would then go use OP kind of super chain messaging to maybe rebalance themselves. And so all of those, it's not like those kind of intra-cluster things are a waste. They're being used. But one of the ways we think about it is that they're almost more like wholesale. The kind of like professional actors, the market makers and solvers can use those to move funds around more seamlessly. But if you're a developer or you're a user, you probably want to use at a higher level where you're able to access all chains and there isn't that discrepancy. And yeah, we're definitely making a bet. Definitely some chains that are being created should not be created, right? And they're going to disappear in a year or less. But I think generally speaking, the trend is correct, where many chains is a good thing. Even the whole Solana thesis, yeah, I think they'll just both be true. For a lot of applications, it absolutely makes sense to be on a chain co-located with other applications, to have all of this infrastructure taken care of for you. And these things will just coexist. Like even within the Ethereum ecosystem, you have something like Base, which is like almost like the Solana thesis, but within the roll-up and app chain world as well, as a hub effectively. And yeah, I think one of the fascinating things is that there's no clear and obvious winner. Even Cosmos has gone through its up and downs, but there's some really nice things there and some really interesting things happening, and Celestia is doing cool stuff there. And then even someone like Avalanche, they've done some interesting game launches, and so there's so many competing people, which is great for innovation. You never know where the next big chain is going to emerge, and that's our philosophy of to not pick winners and just allow people to move between all of them.
What's your framing of the meme coin meta? How do you think about that with respect? And I ask that because I guess my guess here is the dynamics around swapping in or cross-chain bridging in an EVM ecosystem are slightly different from, let's say, an SVM ecosystem, and ignoring the cross-chain aspect for a bit, but within the same VM. How do you view the meta in that kind of context?
Yeah, it's been interesting to play out, because the way NFTs blew up because they were easier to create than ERC20s. In order to launch your ERC20, you used to have to like have an idea for a protocol and put a white paper out, and that was the bar. And then it was like, oh no, I just need to create 10,000 pictures, and now I can create an asset. And now it's just, I just need a word. And so it is funny to see it come full circle. And it's also not surprising, even though they're called non-fungible tokens. So much of what makes NFTs interesting were the fungible pieces of it, the fact, or at least a lot of the like ease of trading them. So it's not surprising. And I think in many ways it feels like one of those like, all right, this is the first most obvious application. If you have a primitive that allows anyone to create assets, for those assets to be like provably scarce, and thus they can retain value. They're also running on rails that have money built into them, that can easily have kind of exchanges and bonding curves and all the rest of it. It's not surprising that effectively the first application is a casino. And what's nice about the casino is it does help to build out a lot of the infrastructure. And that's what you're seeing. But the hope is that there's like more to the primitive than just the casino. And I think that is, again, what's going to be interesting. Even just something like stable coins, I think, are the kind of clear. Not gonna lie, like in some ways, 3 years ago, I thought that maybe like NFTs were the kind of the thing that might crypto mainstream, but in many ways, NFTs are like too controversial. There was, in some ways, like a very powerful primitive, but also lots that can go wrong with it. And so it's very kind of polarizing. Whereas stable coins is so obviously good and very uncontroversial. And so I think you're definitely going to see this kind of things around the proliferation of stablecoins, and you can imagine a world where every app has their own stablecoin. So you need to be moving seamlessly between like similar valued items, and a game having a stablecoin on its own app chain. And so a lot of the infrastructure that we're stress testing around meme coins will benefit. And then you can even think about the prediction market as a really interesting kind of legitimate application. And technically every one of those markets is it's a coin and it has value and it needs to trade. And that is generally my take on this stuff, that it's a bit casino-y, but it's fleshing out the primitive that kind of has a lot of use cases beyond just that.
So Relay touches on the app chain thesis, touches on the meme coin thesis, touches on the stablecoin thesis. My point is there's an angle in there for across all those three metas for you. Just to close out the piece on stablecoins, are you saying CCTP is not enough in terms of the swapping infrastructure and we can do better?
Yeah, definitely. I will say that CCTP is like ahead of its time in terms of a multi-chain asset that can be quickly bridged between chains like natively. And I know that Circle's kind of doing some other interesting things and trying to make that faster, but it's probably not going to be on every chain. So then you end up with these like bridged USDC, and then who's getting the yield from the USDC? Why should it be Circle? So I do think you're just going to see an explosion in different types of stable coins, and they'll have different trade-offs. And yeah, you saw it with Stripe's acquisition of Bridge. That was one of the core products there of allowing applications to have their own stable coin and to capture the yield from it. And I think we're only just beginning on that. And you're going to have this mix of major coins like USDC, and then this like extreme long tail. And we do a lot with USDC. It's like the nice common, there's deep liquidity for it to move between the major chains, but definitely Relay specialty is then like the last mile. And how can we enable interesting things on the long tail of chains? And so we'll see how that all plays out.
Yeah, I'm gonna at least try and put you on the spot, especially because I think, to your point, Relay and even Reservoir earlier, you just touch on so many parts of the infrastructure. What do you think is underbuilt? If there were a couple of developers trying to start a company today, what part of the stack is underbuilt and what part of the stack is overbuilt?
Yeah. Overbuilt, like maybe one that comes to mind, you have things like, in many ways, like overbuilding around things like smart contract wallets of, okay, like that seems like a good direction to go, but it's also a while off when you have 10 infrastructure I think it was like jokes around, there's like more 4337 SDKs than there are users of 4337 transactions. And so there's maybe on the infrastructure side. And I would also say there's like a lot of competition on major chains. And I think where things are really interesting is the long tail of applications and assets. But yeah, I think another thing I would say, which is relevant to, which is that kind of the bridge between off-chain and on-chain money. Very much like we are focused on the on-chain world. And that's why partnering with teams like MoonPay is nice, where we can extend the last mile problem and move between long tail assets and long tail chains. And then that really hard problem of moving between off-chain money and on-chain money, we're happy to let others solve that. But it does feel like one of the kind of blockers to really good adoption is that it does still suck to try and get someone their first on-chain dollar. But hopefully a lot of the things that are happening around stablecoin will just like slowly boil the frog, where people will just have stable coins, maybe without necessarily realizing it. They're just using a savings account and earning yield. It's actually, you're holding USDC. Do you want to send it into some application and use it, or buy a digital item with it? And that's a much easier onboarding problem if people already have on-chain money versus if they have to go from the credit card or from the bank account. And then I think the other thing that comes to mind is related, which is, it is crazy that so much of on-chain economies, they're denominated in ETH or SOL and not USD. And this has been surprising to me how long that is. It makes sense because there are people that have these assets, and so they're looking to spend them and they've appreciated it. So all of a sudden they're ETH rich, and what can I spend my ETH on effectively? But I do think long term, I'm not sure what the time horizon is, you will shift to more like USD based economies. And we've started to see like a few NFT marketplaces be USDC. And I think there's definitely underinvesting there, because right now it can feel like the wrong move to make. Everyone's got ETH, so let's just like denominate things in ETH and build around that. But it does feel like where it will end up eventually if we want it to be larger, more people participating.
Yeah, no, I think so too. This has been great, Peter. Touched on a lot of topics, and this is why I was so keen to have you on as well, because to get into the innards of how you see the different ecosystems and the different metas, you have an angle in all of them. So really appreciate the time. I know we are partnered up on a bunch bunch of different things. So obviously appreciate the partnership and proud to be investors in what you're building.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Today's episode of Modern Money is hosted by Abhay Mavalankar. This episode was researched and produced by Audrey Saccone and edited by Edgar Leal with production support from Gabby Trujillo and the team at Trolley. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate and subscribe to Modern Money on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on social media at MoonPay and at Modern Money Podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time as we continue our conversations here on Modern Money.